Have you ever felt so tired of learning English that you almost decided to quit? I know that feeling very well. In this video, I will tell you a real story from my life in the United States, how one tiny change in my daily routine slowly transformed my English, my confidence, and even my love life. Sometimes, the smallest step can quietly change an entire future. The tiny change that started everything. Some people believe big success requires big actions. But what if a very tiny change could slowly transform an entire life? This story begins with something simple, just 10 minutes a day, speaking slow English to myself in a small apartment in the United States. I did not know it at the time, but that small habit would change my confidence, my future, and even my love story. When I first arrived in the United States, everything felt both exciting and overwhelming at the same time. The streets were wide and clean. The sky looked bigger than I imagined. People walked quickly, holding large cups of coffee, speaking English so naturally it almost sounded like a song. From the outside, it looked like a dream. But inside my head, the reality was very different. Every conversation felt like a small test. A stranger would say something simple like, "How's your day going?" And suddenly my brain would start working very hard. Too hard. My mind tried to translate every word. It tried to check grammar. It tried to remember the correct answer. And while my brain was doing all this work, the conversation had already moved on. Researchers who study language learning explain this clearly. In the early stage of learning a new language, the brain processes information much more slowly. It is not because a person is not intelligent. It is because the brain is building new neural pathways. Imagine building a new road inside your mind. At first, that road is narrow and slow. Cars cannot move quickly. But with practice, the road becomes wider and smoother. Unfortunately, most learners never stay long enough to see that road improve. They quit too early. I almost did the same thing. One morning in late autumn, the weather in my city felt especially cold. The wind moved through the streets, carrying dry leaves across the sidewalk. I walked into a small grocery store near my apartment. Inside, warm air and the smell of fresh bread made the store feel comfortable. Soft music was playing in the background, and a few people were standing in line. I picked up a cup of coffee and a sandwich. Then I walked to the cashier. The woman at the counter smiled politely and asked a quick question. "Paper or plastic?" The words were simple. Very simple. But my brain suddenly stopped. Paper, plastic. I knew those words. Of course I knew them. But something strange happens when language meets pressure. When people are waiting behind you and a stranger is looking directly at you, the brain sometimes freezes. The cashier repeated the question. "Paper bag or plastic bag?" The line behind me was getting longer. I felt the eyes of the people waiting. Finally, I answered, "Yes." The cashier looked confused for a second. Then she smiled kindly and gave me a plastic bag. It was not a disaster. Nothing terrible happened. But when I walked outside, holding my coffee, I felt a quiet disappointment inside my chest. A very small moment can sometimes create a very big question. I sat on a wooden bench outside the store. The sky above was gray, and the cold air made the coffee feel extra warm in my hands. A thought slowly appeared in my mind. Maybe I am not good enough to live here. Many people who move to another country experience something psychologists call language fatigue. The brain becomes tired from constantly translating, guessing meanings, and worrying about mistakes. Over time, that mental exhaustion can quietly destroy motivation. That evening, I sat alone in my small apartment. The room was quiet. My laptop was open, and I searched for a solution like many learners do. How to speak English fluently. Thousands of videos appeared. Speak English in 30 days. Fast tricks for perfect pronunciation. Fluency secrets. But instead of feeling inspired, I felt more pressure. Because my real problem was not grammar. My real problem was fear. Fear of speaking slowly. Fear of saying the wrong word. Fear of sounding strange. Then something unusual happened. Instead of watching another video, I opened the voice recorder on my phone. I placed the phone on the table. For a moment, I just looked at it. Then I started speaking. Slowly. Very slowly. Today, I went to the grocery store. The weather was cold. I tried to answer a question, but I felt nervous. At first, the experience felt awkward. Talking to a phone in an empty room is not something people usually do. But after a few minutes, something surprising happened. My brain relaxed. There was no pressure. No waiting line.
No confused cashier. Just my voice and my thoughts.
Linguists explain that storytelling activates several parts of the brain at the same time. When language connects with personal memories and emotions, the brain remembers words more easily. Without planning it, I had created a tiny daily practice. Every night, I spoke English for 10 minutes.
No complicated vocabulary.
No perfect grammar. Just simple stories about my life. What I saw that day. What food I tried. How strange the American weather felt. The practice was small. Almost invisible. But after a few weeks, I noticed something interesting. My sentences started forming faster. My pronunciation felt more natural. And most importantly, my fear became smaller. Confidence does not arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, like a plant. A little water every day. 10 minutes. That was all. What I did not realize then was that this tiny habit would soon change much more than my English. It would change how I talk to people. It would lead to an unexpected conversation in a coffee shop. And that conversation would slowly turn into something much bigger. A friendship. A partnership. And eventually, a love story that I never planned. All from one small change. 10 minutes of slow English. Sometimes life does not transform through dramatic moments. Sometimes it changes because one person decides to keep going just a little longer than yesterday. And strangely enough, the next chapter of this story began in a place I started visiting almost every morning. A small coffee shop around the corner. That is where things began to get interesting. The cold morning, I wanted to quit. Cold weather in the United States can feel very different from what many people imagine. Movies often show beautiful snow, warm coffee, and smiling people walking slowly under bright winter lights. But real mornings can feel quieter, colder, and sometimes a little lonely. That was exactly how one particular morning felt. The sky was pale gray, and the wind moved through the streets like a quiet whisper. I remember pulling my jacket tighter as I walked down the sidewalk near my apartment. My breath turned into small clouds in the cold air. Everything around me looked calm, but inside my mind, something was not calm at all. Learning English every day had started to feel like climbing a mountain with very heavy shoes. Every conversation required energy. Every simple sentence felt like a small challenge. Researchers in language psychology often say something interesting. When adults learn a new language, the brain tries to protect itself from embarrassment. That protection sometimes appears as hesitation. The brain quietly asks, "What if you make a mistake?" And when that question repeats many times, confidence slowly becomes smaller. That morning, I stopped at a small cafe that many people in the neighborhood liked. It was not a fancy place. Just a warm room with wooden tables, soft yellow lights, and the smell of roasted coffee beans floating in the air. Inside, people were already starting their day. Some were typing on laptops. Some were reading newspapers. Others were quietly talking with friends. The sound of English filled the room. Fast English. Natural English. English that moved quickly between people like a river. I walked to the counter and looked at the menu above the cashier. Even though I had studied English for a long time, menus in real life sometimes looked different from textbook examples. There were new words, strange names for drinks, special combinations I had never seen before. Behind me, 2 people joined the line. Then another person. The pressure returned. When it was my turn, the barista smiled kindly. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" The sentence was friendly and simple. But again, my brain started moving slowly. I wanted to say something clear and confident. Instead, the words inside my head began bumping into each other like cars in traffic. "I want coffee." The barista nodded.
Sure.
"What size?" That question was easy too. Small, medium, large. I knew those words. But at that moment, something unexpected happened again. My mind went blank. The strange thing about language anxiety is that it does not follow logic. A person can understand grammar perfectly while studying at home. But in real conversation, the brain sometimes closes the door for a moment. I paused longer than I should have. The barista waited patiently. "Small?"
She suggested.
"Yes," I said quickly. Then she asked another question. "Room for cream?" That phrase was new to me. Room for cream? My brain tried to translate the sentence piece by piece. Room means space. Cream means milk. But why space for milk? I did not understand. So I simply smiled and said, "Yes." The barista nodded and prepared the drink. When she handed the cup to me, it was filled with black coffee. No milk at all. Only later did I learn that room for cream means leaving space in the cup so the customer can add milk later. It was such a small misunderstanding. But small misunderstandings can feel very large when confidence is already fragile. I took my coffee and sat by the window. Outside, people were walking quickly along the street. Cars moved slowly through the intersection. The morning city was fully awake now. Inside the cafe, conversations continued. English everywhere. Fluent. Comfortable. Natural. For a moment, I wondered if I would ever sound like that. Studies about adult language learners show something fascinating. Many people quit learning not because the language is impossible, but because they believe improvement is impossible. The brain creates a story. I am too slow. I started too late. Others are better. Those stories become mental barriers. Sitting there with my coffee, that kind of story began forming in my mind. Maybe my progress would always be slow. Maybe real conversations would always feel stressful. Maybe my small daily practice at home was not enough. For a few minutes, the idea of quitting felt strangely comfortable. Quitting removes pressure. Quitting removes expectations. But something stopped me. On the table next to me sat a small notebook. It was the notebook I sometimes used to write simple English sentences during my evening practice. I opened it slowly. On one page, I had written something very simple a few nights earlier. Small steps every day create big results. It was not a famous quote. Just a sentence I had written for myself. Still, reading it again made me pause. Because even though my English was far from perfect, something had already started to change during the past few weeks. My listening had improved a little. My sentences were slightly smoother. Most importantly, my fear at home had become smaller. Maybe the progress was invisible to other people, but it was not invisible to me. Psychologists call this microprogress. Small improvements that are almost too tiny to notice day by day, but become powerful over time. Learning a language works exactly like that. Not giant leaps. Tiny movements forward. I took a sip of my coffee and watched the people in the cafe again. Something interesting happened next. At the table across the room, someone looked in my direction. A woman about my age. She had a laptop open and a cup of coffee beside it. She seemed to be working, but every few seconds she glanced around the room as if she enjoyed observing people. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She smiled politely. I smiled back, then quickly looked down at my notebook again. At that time, I had no idea that this small cafe would soon become part of my daily routine. I also had no idea that the woman sitting across the room would soon start a conversation with me. A conversation that would slowly change my life in ways I never expected. Because sometimes the moment you feel closest to quitting is exactly the moment life quietly prepares something new. And that unexpected moment was about to begin, right there in that little coffee shop. A simple daily practice. Some habits look so small that people almost laugh at them. 10 minutes. That was the entire plan. Not 2 hours of studying grammar. Not memorizing hundreds of difficult words. Not repeating complicated pronunciation exercises. Just 10 quiet minutes every evening, speaking slow English and telling a simple story about my own day. At first, it sounded too easy to matter. But something about that simplicity made it powerful. Language scientists often explain that the brain learns faster when practice feels natural and connected to real life. When we force ourselves to memorize isolated vocabulary, the brain treats the information like temporary data. But when we speak about our own experiences, the brain connects language with emotion, memory, and identity. And those connections are much stronger. Of course, I did not know all that in the beginning. I simply knew that speaking to my phone recorder every night felt easier than speaking to real people. No pressure.
No judgment.
No one waiting in line behind me.
Just my voice and my thoughts.
That evening after the coffee shop experience, I returned to my apartment while the sun was slowly disappearing behind the buildings. The room felt quiet and a little dim. Outside the window, city lights were starting to appear one by one. I placed my phone on the table again. The same small recorder. The same 10 minutes. I pressed the red button and began speaking. Today I went to a cafe in the morning. The weather was cold again. I tried to order coffee, but I did not understand one sentence. My voice sounded
slow.
Sometimes I paused to search for the right word. Sometimes I repeated a sentence because it felt awkward. But the strange thing was this. The more I spoke, the easier the next sentence became. Linguists describe this effect as language activation. When the brain starts using a language actively, it slowly warms up, like a muscle preparing for exercise. At the beginning, every movement feels heavy. After a few minutes, the movement becomes smoother. After several weeks, the muscle becomes stronger. Language works the same way. That night, something new happened during my practice. What do you usually drink? In my slow English voice, I answered. I usually drink coffee. Sometimes black coffee. Sometimes coffee with milk. Then I imagined another question. How long have you lived here? I answered again. I moved here recently. I am still learning about this city. The conversation was not real, but my brain reacted as if it were. Psychologists call this mental simulation. Athletes often use the same method. They imagine a race before they run it. They imagine every step, every movement, every breath. When the real moment arrives, the brain already feels familiar with the situation. That night, I realized something important. My biggest problem was not vocabulary.
It was reaction time.
When someone spoke English, my brain needed too long to prepare an answer. But by practicing small imaginary conversations, my brain slowly learned how to respond faster. The next morning, I returned to the same cafe again. Partly for coffee, partly for courage. The air outside was still cold, but the sky looked brighter than the previous day. Sunlight touched the windows of the buildings, making the street feel more alive. Inside the cafe, the familiar smell of roasted beans greeted me again. This time, when I walked to the counter, something inside my mind felt different. Not perfect, but slightly calmer. The barista looked up and smiled. Good morning. My brain recognized the phrase instantly. Good morning, I replied. Small success. Then came the real test. What can I get for you? Yesterday, this question had created confusion. Today, I answered slowly, but clearly. Small coffee, please. The barista nodded. Room for cream? For a split second, I remembered yesterday's confusion. But now I understood the phrase. Yes, please.
2 simple words.
Yet those 2 words felt like a victory. When I received the cup of coffee, I noticed something interesting. Confidence does not arrive as fireworks. It arrives quietly, like sunlight slowly filling a room. I took my coffee and looked around the cafe again. People were working, talking, typing, living their normal lives. And suddenly something became clear. Most people were not paying attention to my English. They were busy with their own thoughts. That realization alone can change a language learner's life. Studies in social psychology show that humans often overestimate how much other people notice their mistakes. This effect is called the spotlight illusion. We believe everyone is watching us. But in reality, most people are simply thinking about themselves. Sitting there with my coffee, I felt the beginning of a new mindset. Maybe I did not need perfect English. Maybe I only needed honest communication. That idea felt freeing. I opened my notebook again and wrote a short sentence. Small progress is still progress. While I was writing, I noticed movement from the table across the room. The same woman I had seen yesterday was sitting there again with her laptop. This time, she closed the laptop and looked around the cafe. Then her eyes stopped on my notebook. For a second, she seemed curious. She stood up, picked up her coffee cup, and slowly walked in my direction. My heart started beating a little faster, because spontaneous conversations are often the most difficult moments for language learners. She stopped near my table and smiled.
"Hi," she said.
"Are you studying something?" The question was friendly, but it was also unexpected. And in that moment, my tiny 10-minute practice at home was about to face its first real test. Because this simple conversation would soon become the beginning of something I never planned. Something much bigger than language learning. Something that would slowly change my entire life in America. The coffee shop conversation. Sometimes life changes in very quiet ways. No dramatic music. No big announcement. Just a simple moment when someone walks over and says a friendly word. That morning in the cafe, the woman who had been sitting across the room walked toward my table with her coffee in her hand. Her steps were relaxed, and her expression looked curious but kind.
"Hi," she said again.
Her voice sounded calm and natural. "Are you studying something?" For a moment, my brain paused. Real conversations always move faster than practice at home. But this time something interesting happened. Instead of panic, I felt a small memory appear in my mind. 10 minutes. My daily practice. The imaginary conversations I had spoken to my phone. I took a breath and answered slowly. Yes, I am practicing English. The sentence was simple, but it felt honest. She smiled immediately. "Oh, that's cool," she said. "Are you new here?" Her English was clear, but still faster than my brain preferred. I focused carefully on each word, the way language teachers often recommend. "Yes," I replied. "I moved here recently." Then something surprising happened. She pulled the chair across from me and asked, "Do you mind if I sit here for a minute?" In many cultures, that might feel unusual. But in the United States, casual conversations with strangers sometimes happen naturally, especially in places like cafes.
"Of course," I said.
She sat down and placed her coffee on the table. "My name is Emily," she said. "I'm Daniel," I replied. The conversation had officially begun. At first, the sentences moved slowly. That was good for me. Slow conversations are the best training for learners. Emily asked where I came from. I explained briefly. She nodded with interest and said something encouraging. "That's brave. Moving to a new country is not easy." Her words surprised me a little. Most people see immigration as an adventure, but she understood something deeper, the quiet courage it requires. Psychologists often say that empathy is one of the most powerful tools in communication. When someone shows understanding, the brain relaxes. And when the brain relaxes, language flows more easily. That was exactly what happened. Our conversation became smoother. Emily spoke clearly and naturally, but she also seemed to notice that I was learning English. Without making it obvious, she slowed down her sentences slightly. That small kindness made a big difference. We talked about simple topics. The weather, the city, favorite foods, everyday things. And strangely, those ordinary topics felt like small victories. Because each sentence I completed felt like crossing a tiny bridge between two worlds. Researchers who study language acquisition often explain something important. Real conversations create stronger learning than isolated study.
Why?
Because conversations contain emotion. When you remember how a conversation felt, your brain also remembers the words connected to that feeling. That morning, the cafe felt warmer than before. Not because of the coffee, because of connection. At one point, Emily looked at the small notebook on my table. "Are those your English notes?" she asked. I nodded.
Yes.
I write small sentences. She leaned slightly closer and read one of the lines quietly. Small progress is still progress. Then she smiled. That's actually a really good rule for life, she said. Hearing someone else read my sentence felt strange, but encouraging. For a moment, I realized something important. My English did not need to be impressive. It only needed to be understandable. That idea may sound obvious, but many learners forget it. They imagine that fluency means perfection. In reality, communication simply means sharing meaning. The conversation continued for about 15 minutes. For someone learning a language, 15 minutes of natural conversation can feel like an hour-long workout for the brain. But it was a good kind of tired, the kind that feels like progress. Before leaving, Emily finished the last sip of her coffee and stood up. "Well," she said, "I come here most mornings before work." Then she added something unexpected. "If you want to practice English, you can join me sometimes." The invitation was simple, but to me, it felt like an opportunity. Language teachers often recommend something called consistent exposure. The brain learns faster when it hears and uses a language regularly in real situations. Emily's offer was exactly that. Regular conversation. Real English.
No classroom.
No pressure. Just coffee and words. "That would be great," I said.
And I meant it.
She smiled again and picked up her bag. "See you around, Daniel." Then she walked toward the door and disappeared into the bright morning sunlight. For a moment, I stayed at the table, thinking. A week earlier, ordering coffee had felt like a stressful challenge. Now I had just completed a 15-minute conversation with a native English speaker. Not perfectly, but successfully.
Tiny change.
Tiny result. At least that was what I believed at the time. But life was preparing something much bigger. Because over the next few weeks, those casual morning conversations would become a routine.
Coffee.
Stories. Laughter. Slow English turning into natural English. And slowly, something else would begin to grow between two people who originally just wanted to talk. A connection neither of us expected. And that quiet connection would soon face its first real test. Because learning language is one challenge. Understanding culture is another story. Learning life, not just English. Language is more than vocabulary. It is also culture. It is the way people greet each other in the morning. The way they laugh at small jokes. The way they talk about work, dreams, and everyday problems. At the beginning, I thought I was only learning English words. But those morning conversations in the cafe slowly taught me something much bigger. I was learning life in America. The routine started very simply. Almost every weekday morning, I walked to the same small cafe. The air was usually cool, sometimes windy, sometimes bright with sunlight reflecting on the windows of nearby buildings. Inside, the cafe looked familiar now. The same soft music, The same warm smell of roasted coffee beans. The same quiet sound of keyboards and conversations. And most mornings, Emily was already there. Laptop open. Coffee on the table. A calm smile when she saw me walk in. "Morning, Daniel," she would say. At first, our conversations stayed simple. "How's your day going? Did you sleep well? Busy week?" Those small phrases may sound ordinary, but for someone learning English, they are extremely valuable. Linguists call them daily language patterns. They are the sentences people use again and again in real life. And repetition is one of the brain's favorite learning tools. Research in cognitive science shows that when the brain hears the same patterns regularly in different contexts, those patterns slowly become automatic. That is exactly what was happening to me. Without studying grammar books, my brain started recognizing structures naturally. For example, Emily often asked about my plans. "What are you working on this week?" After hearing that question several times, I began answering more smoothly. "This week I'm trying to improve my speaking. This week I'm busy with work." The sentences were not complicated, but they were real. And real language is easier for the brain to remember. One morning, our conversation moved to a slightly deeper topic. Emily asked, "What surprised you most about living in the United States?" It was an interesting question. I paused for a moment and thought carefully. "The independence," I said slowly. She tilted her head with curiosity. "What do you mean?" I explained that many Americans seem very comfortable doing things alone. Eating alone. Traveling alone. Moving to new cities for work. In my culture, people often rely more on family support and close community. Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That's true," she said. "Here, people grow up learning to be independent very early." Then she added something I had never considered. "But independence can also feel lonely sometimes." That sentence stayed in my mind, because it revealed something deeper about culture. Every culture has strengths. Every culture has challenges. Living in a new country slowly teaches you both. Over the next few weeks, our conversations continued exploring these differences. Weather was one of the first topics. American weather can be surprisingly dramatic. One week the air felt warm and sunny. The next week the temperature dropped suddenly, and strong winds moved through the city streets. Emily laughed when she saw my confusion one morning. "Welcome to American weather," she said. "It likes surprises." Another topic we often discussed was work culture. In the United States, many people move frequently for career opportunities. Changing jobs or cities is quite common. At first, that idea felt strange to me. Back home, stability is often more valued. But Emily explained it from a different perspective. "People here grow up believing they can create new opportunities," she said. "So moving somewhere new doesn't feel as scary." Her explanation made sense. Language learning suddenly became connected to something bigger again. Understanding the values behind the words. Researchers who study cross-cultural communication often emphasize this idea. Language is deeply connected to worldview. When you understand how people think, their language becomes easier to understand too. Another interesting moment happened one morning when Emily asked about my daily English practice. "So, how do you practice speaking?" she asked. I told her about my small habit, 10 minutes every evening, talking to my phone recorder, telling stories about my day. For a second, she looked surprised. Then she smiled. That's actually a really smart method, she said. Her reaction encouraged me. Sometimes learners doubt their own methods, but hearing positive feedback from someone else can strengthen motivation. Emily even suggested something new. Why don't you tell me one of your daily stories right now? I laughed nervously.
Now. Sure, she said. So I tried.
Slow English again. Simple sentences again. I described something funny that had happened at the grocery store the night before. I accidentally bought a very spicy sauce because I misunderstood the label. Emily listened carefully. Then she laughed. Your storytelling is good, she said. That comment surprised me. Good storytelling? I had never thought about English that way, but it made sense. Humans naturally love stories. Scientists say storytelling activates multiple areas of the brain, language, emotion, imagination. That is why stories are easier to remember than random information. Maybe my small 10-minute habit was powerful for exactly that reason. It was not just speaking. It was storytelling. And slowly, those morning conversations began to feel more comfortable, more natural, more personal. Sometimes we talked for 20 minutes, sometimes even longer. Yet something interesting was quietly changing beneath the surface. Our conversations were no longer just about English practice. They were about life, dreams, experiences, opinions. The distance between two strangers was slowly disappearing. And when that distance disappears, something new often begins to grow. Friendship, connection, possibility. At that time, I still believed this was simply a helpful friendship in a cafe. Two people talking about language and culture. But life often hides important chapters inside ordinary routines. Because the next stage of the story would test more than my English skills. It would test my understanding of culture. And it would reveal emotions I had not expected. What began as language practice was slowly turning into something much more complicated. And neither of us fully realized it yet. When culture shock hits, many people imagine that living in the United States is simple once you understand the language. But something interesting happens after the first few months. You realize that language is only one part of communication. The other part is culture. And culture can be much harder to understand. During the first weeks of my conversations with Emily, everything felt easy. We talked about weather, food, and daily routines. Those topics were safe and comfortable. But slowly, our discussions became deeper. That was when I began to experience something experts call culture shock. Culture shock is not always dramatic. It does not always happen the first day you arrive in a new country. Sometimes it appears quietly, weeks or months later, when you begin noticing small differences in how people think and behave. One afternoon, Emily and I decided to meet outside the cafe. The weather was warmer that day, and the sun was bright in the sky. Let's walk in the park, she suggested. The park was only a few blocks away. Trees lined the pathways, and many people were walking their dogs or jogging slowly. We found an empty bench near a small lake. The water was calm, reflecting the blue sky above. For a while, we just talked about ordinary things again. Work schedules, weekend plans, new restaurants in the neighborhood. Then Emily asked a question that made me think carefully. Do you ever feel homesick? Her tone was gentle. I looked at the lake before answering. Yes, I said quietly. Sometimes. She nodded, as if she understood. Homesickness is something many immigrants experience, even when they are excited about their new life. It is not only about missing a place. It is about missing familiar feelings. The way people greet each other. The sounds of your native language in the street. The comfort of knowing exactly how everything works. In a new country, even simple things require extra thinking. How to open a bank account. How health insurance works. What people expect in professional conversations. All those small systems can feel confusing at first. Emily listened carefully while I explained some of these experiences. Then, she shared something surprising. Even people born here sometimes feel culture shock, she said. I looked at her with curiosity.
How?
She smiled slightly. When people move from one state to another, things can still feel different. In a large country like the United States, culture can vary from region to region. Different accents, different food traditions, different attitudes toward work and life. That idea helped me relax. Maybe cultural confusion was not a personal failure. Maybe it was simply part of adapting to a new environment. Psychologists explain that culture shock usually happens in stages. First comes excitement. Everything feels new and interesting. Then comes frustration. Small differences become tiring. Finally comes adjustment, when people slowly understand the new culture and find their place within it. That day in the park, I realized I was somewhere between frustration and adjustment. And Emily, without knowing it, had become part of my adjustment process. Our conversations were teaching me more than grammar. They were teaching me how people here think. One moment from that afternoon stayed in my memory. We were discussing work culture again. I mentioned that in my home country, people sometimes avoid direct disagreement during conversations. Respect and harmony are often important values. Emily nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting, she said. Here, people sometimes appreciate direct honesty. Direct honesty. That concept sounded simple, but it could create misunderstandings between cultures. For example, in American workplaces, expressing an opinion clearly can be seen as confidence. But in other cultures, the same behavior might feel too direct or even rude. Understanding these differences became part of my language learning, because communication is not only about vocabulary. It is also about expectations. As we talked, I realized that Emily had been helping me navigate these cultural differences naturally. She explained certain expressions. She described why people behave in certain ways. Sometimes she even corrected small misunderstandings gently. One evening, for example, I told her that Americans seemed very serious about their schedules. She laughed. You mean punctual? Yes, I said. That word became another small addition to my vocabulary. Punctual. Arriving on time. Respecting other people's schedules. In American culture, punctuality often represents professionalism and reliability. That tiny lesson helped me avoid several future misunderstandings. The more we talked, the more confident I became. But confidence can sometimes create new questions. Because as our conversations grew longer and more personal, I began noticing something else. Emily seemed genuinely interested in our discussions. Not just politely interested. Truly engaged. Sometimes she asked thoughtful questions about my childhood. Sometimes she shared stories about her own life growing up in the United States. Our conversations were no longer short practice sessions. They were becoming real connections between two people from different worlds. And that connection created a new kind of nervousness. Language nervousness was slowly disappearing. But another kind of nervousness was quietly arriving. Emotional nervousness. Because when two people talk regularly, laugh together, and understand each other's stories, something natural can begin to grow. Something neither person plans. Friendship was already there. But the next stage of this story would reveal whether our connection was only friendship or something more. And sometimes those questions appear when you least expect them. In the middle of a normal conversation, on a perfectly ordinary day. A love story growing slowly. Some relationships begin with a big moment, a dramatic meeting, a surprising event, a powerful first impression. But other relationships grow quietly. Slow conversations, shared routines, small moments that slowly connect two lives. Looking back now, the beginning of our story was very simple.
Just coffee.
Just English practice. Just two people talking in a small cafe in the United States. But something was changing beneath those ordinary conversations. At first, Emily and I only met in the mornings. The cafe became our comfortable place. A familiar table near the window. 2 cups of coffee. A few quiet minutes before the busy day started. Our conversations were still useful for my English practice. But they were no longer only about language.
They were about life.
Emily sometimes talked about her childhood. She grew up in a small town in another state. She told me stories about long summer evenings, neighborhood barbecues, and learning to ride a bicycle on quiet streets. Her stories painted pictures in my mind. I realized that language learning becomes easier when words are connected to images and emotions. That is why storytelling is such a powerful tool for practicing English. The brain remembers stories much better than isolated vocabulary. I also shared my own stories, memories from my hometown, family traditions, food that reminded me of home. Sometimes my sentences were still slow, but Emily listened patiently. She never interrupted. She gave my thoughts time to arrive. That patience created something important. Comfort. Comfort is essential for learning any language. When people feel safe in a conversation, the brain stops worrying about mistakes and begins focusing on meaning instead. Psychologists call this low anxiety learning. The lower the stress, the faster the brain absorbs language. Without realizing it, Emily had created the perfect environment for my English to grow. One afternoon, our routine changed slightly. Instead of meeting in the morning, Emily asked if I wanted to walk through the city after work. There's a small street market near downtown, she said. It's fun to explore. I agreed. The evening air was warm, and the city looked different at night. Lights from restaurants and small shops reflected on the sidewalks. People were walking slowly, enjoying the end of the day. Street musicians played soft music on the corner. The market was full of colors and sounds. Food stands with different cuisines. Handmade crafts. Small groups of people laughing and talking. Emily walked beside me, explaining things as we moved through the crowd. That stand sells local honey, she said. Over there is a bakery that makes really good pies. Her explanations felt like a live cultural guide. Living in a new country becomes much easier when someone helps translate not only the language but also the environment. At one stand, we stopped to buy 2 cups of hot chocolate. The evening air was becoming cooler, and the warm drink felt comforting. We sat at a small outdoor table. For a few minutes, we simply watched people walking by. Then Emily asked a question that felt slightly more personal. Do you ever think about staying here long term? The question surprised me. I looked at the crowd before answering. I'm not sure yet, I said honestly. Sometimes I feel excited. Sometimes I feel uncertain. She nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Then she added something softly. But you're doing really well. That encouragement meant more than she probably realized. Moving to a new country often creates moments of doubt. You wonder if your efforts are enough, if your progress is fast enough. Hearing someone say, "You're doing well," can change your entire perspective. We continued talking as the market slowly became quieter. The conversation moved from work to hobbies, from hobbies to dreams. Emily told me she loved traveling. She enjoyed exploring new cities and learning about different cultures. I told her I enjoyed observing everyday life and turning those observations into small stories. She smiled. That explains your storytelling, she said. I laughed. Maybe. Then something interesting happened. Our conversation paused. Not an uncomfortable silence. A comfortable one. Sometimes silence between two people says more than words. In that quiet moment, I realized something. I was no longer nervous speaking English with her. Not because my grammar had become perfect, but because the conversation felt natural, human, real. Language learning experts often say that fluency appears when language stops feeling like a subject and starts feeling like a tool for connection. That night, English had become exactly that. A bridge, not a barrier. We finished our drinks and started walking back toward the subway station. The city lights reflected in the windows of tall buildings. At the station entrance, Emily stopped and looked at me. I'm glad we met at the cafe, she said. Me too, I replied. And I truly meant it. What started as a simple language practice had become something meaningful. Friendship, understanding, possibility. But life rarely moves forward without challenges. Just when things begin to feel comfortable, reality introduces new tests. In the coming months, Emily and I would face situations that were not as simple as coffee conversations or evening walks. Work pressure, cultural differences, personal doubts. And those challenges would force us to answer an important question. Was our connection strong enough to survive real life? Because sometimes the hardest part of any story is not the beginning. It is the moment when feelings become real. The difficult season. Life has an interesting rhythm. When things begin to feel comfortable, something unexpected often appears to test that comfort. The same thing happened in my life in the United States. For several months, my routine felt stable. Morning conversations at the cafe with Emily. Work during the day. 10 minutes of English storytelling practice every night in my apartment. My confidence was growing slowly. Not dramatically, but steadily. Researchers often describe language learning as a gradual curve. At first, progress feels slow, almost invisible. Then suddenly one day you notice something surprising. You understand more. You speak more naturally. You hesitate less. I was entering that stage. But life outside the cafe was becoming more complicated. At work, new responsibilities appeared. My manager asked me to participate more actively in team discussions. That meant speaking English in meetings, sometimes with several native speakers talking quickly. Group conversations were still difficult for me. One afternoon, I sat in a meeting room with 6 colleagues around a large table. A project discussion was happening. Ideas moved quickly from one person to another. I understood most of the topic, but when it was time for me to speak, the same old feeling returned. My brain slowed down. Words arrived late. The moment passed before my sentence was ready. I left the meeting feeling frustrated. That evening, I walked to the cafe later than usual. Emily was already there, reading something on her laptop. She looked up when I arrived. "You look tired," she said gently. I sat down and sighed. "Work meeting," I explained. "Too many fast conversations." She nodded. "That happens to everyone learning a new language." Then she said something interesting. "You know, communication in meetings is also a skill, even for native speakers." Her comment surprised me. I had always believed that native speakers never struggled with communication. But Emily explained something I had never considered before. In meetings, she said, people need to organize their thoughts quickly. That's difficult even in your own language. Psychologists call this cognitive load, the amount of mental effort your brain uses at one time. When you speak a second language, the cognitive load becomes heavier. Your brain processes vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and ideas simultaneously. That explanation made me feel less discouraged. Maybe my struggle was not failure. Maybe it was simply part of the process. Still, the following weeks were not easy. Work demands increased. My schedule became more stressful. Some days I felt too tired to practice English at night. My 10-minute storytelling habit started to feel like an extra responsibility. One evening I looked at my phone recorder and thought, maybe skipping one day won't matter. Then 2 days passed without practice. Then 3. Something strange began happening again. My confidence felt slightly weaker. Not dramatically, but noticeably. This is something scientists often observe in skill development. Skills grow with consistent repetition. When the repetition stops, the brain slowly loses the automatic patterns it was building. Language learning is especially sensitive to this. Without practice, fluency can fade. During this period, Emily also seemed busier. Her work schedule changed, and some mornings she could not visit the cafe. Our regular conversations became less frequent. Suddenly, the routine that helped me feel stable was disappearing. And when routines disappear, doubt sometimes returns. One rainy evening, I sat alone in the cafe with my coffee. The window beside my table showed reflections of streetlights and moving cars outside. Emily had texted earlier saying she would be working late. The cafe felt quieter than usual. For the first time in a long while, the same question returned to my mind. Am I really making progress here? Learning a language, building a life in a new country, creating relationships across cultures. These things require patience. But patience is not always easy. Sometimes the brain wants immediate results. Psychologists explain that humans naturally prefer quick rewards. When progress takes months or years, motivation can weaken. That evening, I opened my notebook again. Inside were many small sentences I had written during previous weeks. Small progress is still progress. Speak slowly, but keep speaking. Stories help the brain remember. Reading those lines felt like hearing advice from my past self. And suddenly, I remembered the reason I started this journey. Not to become perfect, but to keep moving forward. That night when I returned home, I picked up my phone again. The recorder icon was still there, waiting. I pressed the red button. Today was a difficult day, I said slowly. I felt tired at work. I felt confused again, but I am still here, and I will continue. The sentences were simple, but they were honest. And honesty has a powerful effect on the mind. Psychologists say that speaking about our challenges helps reduce emotional stress. It allows the brain to process experiences more clearly. In a way, my English practice had become more than language training. It had become a personal reflection habit, a way to understand my own journey. The next morning, something unexpected happened. When I entered the cafe, Emily was already there. But she looked different, more serious. When she saw me, she closed her laptop slowly. "Daniel," she said, "I need to tell you something." Her voice sounded calm, but I sensed something important behind her words. At that moment, I realized the difficult season in my life was not finished yet. In fact, it was just beginning. Because the next part of our story would test not only my persistence with English, but also the strength of the connection that had quietly grown between us. The power of tiny changes. Emily's voice that morning sounded different. Not cold, not distant, just serious. When someone says, "I need to tell you something," the mind immediately starts imagining many possibilities. Good news, bad news, something unexpected. I sat down slowly across from her in the cafe. The familiar table by the window suddenly felt less comfortable than usual. Outside, the morning street looked busy. Cars passed, people hurried to work, and the city continued moving like always. But inside the cafe, time seemed to slow down. Emily took a small breath. "My company is sending me to another city," she said. The sentence was simple, but the meaning felt heavy. "For how long?" I asked. "Maybe a year," she replied. "Maybe longer." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. When people move to new cities in the United States, it often happens quickly. Career opportunities can appear suddenly, and many people accept them without hesitation. I understood that. Still, the news created a strange feeling inside me. Our routine, our daily conversations, the small world we had built around coffee and language practice. It was about to change. Emily looked at me carefully. "I didn't want you to hear it from someone else," she said. "I wanted to tell you directly." I appreciated that honesty. Honesty had always been part of our conversations. After a moment, I smiled slightly. "That's a good opportunity for you," I said. And I meant it. Real friendship supports growth, even when growth creates distance. But that did not mean the moment was easy. For a while, we talked quietly about practical details. When she would move, which city she would go to, what kind of work she would be doing. The conversation was calm, but something emotional existed under the surface. When you share many conversations with someone, their presence becomes part of your routine. And routines shape our daily lives more than we realize. Psychologists often say that humans rely on routines to create mental stability. When those routines change, the brain needs time to adjust. After about 20 minutes, Emily looked at my notebook again on the table. You're still writing your English notes, she said. I nodded. And still recording my daily stories. She smiled. I'm really impressed by that habit. Her words made me think. The habit had become so normal that I almost forgot how important it was. 10 minutes every evening. No complicated method.
Just speaking slowly about my day.
I looked at her and said something honestly. That tiny habit changed everything for me. She raised her eyebrows slightly. Everything. I laughed. Almost everything. Then I explained. When I first arrived in the United States, I felt lost during conversations. My brain froze. My confidence disappeared. But the small daily practice had trained my mind in a quiet way. Every night my brain practiced organizing thoughts in English. Every night I built tiny pathways in my memory. Scientists who study skill development often talk about compound improvement. A 1% improvement every day may feel invisible, but over months, those tiny improvements combine into something powerful. Language learning follows the same pattern. Tiny daily practice. Tiny daily courage. Tiny daily persistence. Eventually, the results become visible. Emily listened carefully. Then she said something thoughtful. You know, your English today is very different from the first day we met. That comment surprised me. Really?
Really, she said.
You speak more naturally now. Hearing that felt satisfying. Sometimes we cannot see our own progress clearly because we experience it slowly. But other people notice the difference. That morning conversation lasted longer than usual. Maybe both of us understood that the routine was ending. Before leaving, Emily finished her coffee and stood up. I'll still visit this city sometimes, she said. And I'll keep practicing English, I replied. We both smiled. Life rarely moves in straight lines.
People meet.
People grow. Sometimes they move in different directions for a while, but growth always leaves something valuable behind. After Emily left the cafe that day, I stayed at the table a little longer. Sunlight was entering through the window now, touching the notebook in front of me. I opened it and wrote a new sentence. A tiny change can build a big life. At that moment, I realized something important. Even if Emily moved away, the journey she helped start would continue. The habit, the confidence, the courage to speak. Those things belong to me now. That evening, when I recorded my 10-minute story again, I spoke with a calm voice. Today my friend told me she will move to another city. I felt a little sad, but I also realized something. Small habits can change a person's life. When I finished recording, I felt peaceful, because deep inside, I knew this story was not ending. In fact, it was moving toward a new chapter. One that would test how strong my progress really was. Because soon, life would give me a chance to make a much bigger decision. A decision not only about language, but about love and the future. Marriage and a new chapter. Life sometimes moves quietly for a while, and then suddenly presents a decision that changes everything. After Emily moved to another city, the cafe mornings became very different. The same tables were there. The same warm smell of coffee filled the room. The same music played softly in the background. But one chair was empty. At first, the silence felt strange. For months, our conversations had become part of my daily rhythm. Talking about language, culture, work, and life had helped me grow in ways I never expected. Now the routine was gone, but something important had already changed inside me. My English practice continued every night. 10 minutes. The same recorder on my phone. The same slow storytelling about my day. But the stories were different now. They were more confident, more reflective. Instead of focusing only on vocabulary, I started focusing on ideas. What I learned that day. What surprised me about American life. What I felt about the changes happening around me. Linguists often say that advanced language learning happens when you begin thinking in the language, not just translating. Without noticing it, I had reached that stage. English was slowly becoming part of my thinking process. Several weeks passed. Emily and I stayed in contact through messages and occasional phone calls. Sometimes we laughed about small things from our past cafe conversations. Other times we talked about work, stress, or plans for the future. Long-distance communication can be challenging, especially when two people live busy lives in different cities. But interestingly, our conversations became deeper. When people cannot meet every day, they often start sharing more meaningful thoughts. One evening, after finishing work, I walked through the city park near my apartment. The weather was warm again. Spring had fully arrived. Trees were covered with green leaves, and the air smelled fresh after a light rain. My phone vibrated. It was a message from Emily. "Are you free to talk?" I called her. Her voice sounded slightly tired but happy. "How are things?" I asked. "Busy," she said. "But good." We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. Then the conversation became quiet for a moment. Finally, she said something unexpected. "I miss our cafe talks." I smiled. "Me too." There was another pause. Then she said something that surprised me. "Have you ever thought about visiting my city?" The question was simple, but it carried many possibilities. Traveling to see someone is different from casual friendship. It means effort. Attention. Curiosity about what the relationship might become. I thought about it carefully. "Maybe I should," I said slowly. She laughed softly. "I think you should." A few weeks later, I took a train to visit her city. The journey took several hours. During the trip, I watched the landscape pass outside the window. Fields, small towns, long highways connecting distant places. The United States is a very large country. Traveling between cities reminds you how wide the land really is. When the train arrived, Emily was waiting near the station entrance. For a moment, it felt strange seeing her in a completely new place. But when she smiled and waved, the feeling of familiarity returned immediately. "Welcome," she said. Her city looked different from mine. The streets were wider, the buildings lower, and the atmosphere felt slightly quieter. She showed me around during the weekend. Parks, small restaurants, local markets. Everywhere we went, we continued talking the way we always had. About culture, about language, about life goals. But there was something new in the air now. The connection between us felt stronger, more intentional. On the second evening, we walked along a river that passed through the city. Lights from nearby buildings reflected softly on the water. For a while, we walked without speaking. Then Emily stopped and looked at the river. "You know," she said quietly, "meeting you changed my routine too." That sentence surprised me. "How?" I asked. She smiled slightly. I started paying more attention to conversations, to listening more carefully. Listening. That skill is often forgotten in language learning. But communication depends on listening just as much as speaking. Then she looked at me again. Also, I realized something.
What? I asked.
She took a small breath. I think our story is more than just friendship. Her words were calm, but honest. For a moment, the sounds of the river and distant traffic filled the silence around us. Relationships often grow slowly, but the moment when feelings become clear can feel very powerful. I thought about everything that had happened during the past year. The small cafe, the first nervous conversation, the tiny habit of speaking English to my phone. All those small moments had slowly connected two lives. I think so too, I said. And that was the beginning of a new chapter. Not just language learning, not just cultural exchange, but building a life together. Over the following year, Emily and I spent more time visiting each other's cities. Eventually, we made a decision. A serious one. We decided to build our future in the same place. And that decision would soon lead to another milestone. Marriage. A new home. And the next stage of our story in America. But even then, I never forgot the small habit that started everything. 10 minutes. One recorder. One tiny change that quietly transformed my entire life. Raising kids between cultures. Life changes in interesting ways after marriage. Before, your story feels like a personal journey. Your decisions affect mostly your own life, your goals, your habits, your routines. But once you build a family, the story becomes bigger. Suddenly, the future is no longer only about you. It becomes about the next generation. After Emily and I decided to live in the same city, our life slowly found a new rhythm. We rented a small apartment near a quiet neighborhood. Trees lined the streets, and there was a park only a few minutes away. In the mornings, sunlight entered through the kitchen window while we prepared coffee together. Sometimes I still laughed when I remembered my first nervous coffee order in America. Paper or plastic. At that time, even simple questions felt difficult. Now life had moved far beyond those moments. But interestingly, the habits that helped me survive those early challenges were still part of my routine. Especially one habit. 10 minutes. Speaking slowly. Telling stories. Not to a phone anymore, but to someone much smaller. Our child. The first time I held my child in my arms, I felt something impossible to describe with simple words. Responsibility.
Hope. Love.
All at the same time. And suddenly, language learning gained a completely new meaning. Because I was no longer learning English only for myself. I was now part of a multicultural family. Our home contained two cultural worlds, different traditions, different childhood memories, different ways of expressing emotions. Psychologists who study bilingual families often say something important. Children raised with multiple languages develop unique cognitive advantages. Their brains become flexible. They learn to switch between different ways of thinking. But for parents, the process can be challenging. Which language should we speak at home? How do we help children feel connected to both cultures? Emily and I talked about these questions many times. One evening, while sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, we discussed it again. I want our child to understand both worlds, Emily said. So do I, I replied. But how could we do that naturally? The answer came from a place I already knew well. Storytelling. The same small technique that helped me learn English years earlier. Every evening before bedtime, I began telling simple stories. Slow English. Clear sentences. Small, everyday adventures. Sometimes the stories were about animals exploring a forest. Sometimes about a curious child discovering new places. Other times, the stories were about my own experiences when I first arrived in America. Emily often listened from the doorway and smiled. "You're using your English practice again," she said one night. I laughed. Some habits never disappear. And she was right. The method that once helped me build confidence was now helping my child understand language and imagination. Scientists explain that storytelling stimulates multiple areas of a child's brain: language processing, emotional connection, and creative thinking. In simple words, stories help children learn faster. But something else happened too. As I told those bedtime stories, I noticed how comfortable English felt in my voice. Years earlier, every sentence required effort. Now the words flowed naturally. Sometimes I paused and thought about the long journey behind that change. The small apartment where I spoke to my phone recorder. The nervous cafe conversations. The cultural misunderstandings. The moments when quitting felt tempting. All those experiences were part of the same path. Emily once said something that stayed in my mind. "Your English story is really a life story." At first, I thought she was joking, but later I understood what she meant. Language is not just grammar and vocabulary. Language is connection. Connection creates relationships. Relationships create families. And families create the future. One evening, after finishing a bedtime story, my child asked a simple question. "Tell another one." I smiled. "Tomorrow." Because good stories should leave a little curiosity for the next day. Curiosity is one of the strongest learning forces in the human brain. Researchers often say that curiosity activates dopamine, the chemical that motivates exploration and learning. Maybe that is why storytelling works so well for language practice. It keeps the brain interested. Years earlier, curiosity helped me keep speaking English even when it felt uncomfortable. Now that same curiosity was shaping the mind of the next generation. Sometimes I still visited the cafe where everything began. The place had changed slightly over time. Different baristas, new decorations, but the warm smell of coffee remained the same. Sitting there one afternoon, I realized something meaningful. The journey that started with insecurity had transformed into confidence. Not perfect English, but real communication. Not just survival in a new country, but building a home there. And yet, one final realization was waiting for me. A realization about that tiny change from the beginning. Because when I looked back at the entire journey, one truth became very clear. Small actions, repeated every day, can create a life far bigger than we expect. And that truth would become the final message of the story. A tiny change, a big life. Looking back now, the entire journey almost feels unreal. Not dramatic like a movie. Not perfect like a fairy tale. Just a long chain of small moments. And every moment started from something very simple. A tiny change. Years ago, I arrived in the United States with many doubts in my mind. I remember standing in small stores trying to understand fast English. I remember feeling nervous when people asked simple questions. Paper or plastic? At that time, those 3 words felt like a complicated puzzle. My brain froze. My confidence disappeared. And for a brief moment, I almost believed that learning English and building a life in a new country might be too difficult. But something small stopped me from quitting. Not a big decision. Not a dramatic speech. Just a quiet habit. 10 minutes. Speaking slowly. Telling simple stories about my day. At first, that habit looked almost meaningless. 10 minutes is a very small part of a day. Many people spend more time scrolling on their phones or watching random videos. But those 10 minutes were different. Because every night my brain practiced organizing thoughts in English. Every night I spoke without fear of judgment. Every night I built tiny connections between words, memories, and emotions. Scientists often explain that human progress follows the principle of compound growth. If you improve just a little every day, 1%, 0.5%, the changes may look invisible at first. But after many months, those tiny improvements combine into something powerful. That is exactly what happened in my story. The tiny practice helped me become more comfortable speaking English. That comfort helped me start conversations. One of those conversations happened in a small cafe. And that conversation introduced me to Emily. At that time, I did not realize how important that moment would become. It was just 2 people talking about language and culture. But life often hides important chapters inside ordinary conversations. Coffee turned into friendship. Friendship slowly became something deeper. And that connection eventually became a marriage, a family, a home. Sometimes people ask me a question. What was the most important English learning technique you used? They expect a complicated answer. A special textbook. A secret pronunciation method. A fast learning strategy. But my answer is always very simple. Storytelling. Speaking slowly. 10 minutes every day. Language teachers often confirm this idea. The most powerful learning methods are usually the most natural ones. Humans learn language through storytelling long before modern classrooms existed. Children learn language through stories. Families pass culture through stories. Even history survives through stories. When we tell stories, the brain connects words with meaning, emotion, and imagination. And that connection makes language stick in memory. But the biggest change was not vocabulary. The biggest change was confidence. Confidence is the invisible bridge between knowing a language and actually using it. Many learners know enough English to communicate. But fear stops them. Fear of mistakes. Fear of judgment. Fear of sounding imperfect. The small daily habit slowly removed that fear from my mind. Because when you speak every day, even imperfectly, your brain learns an important lesson. Mistakes are not dangerous. They are simply part of learning. Over time, that mindset spreads into other areas of life. Work conversations become easier. Meeting new people becomes less stressful. And sometimes, unexpected opportunities appear, like meeting someone who changes your life. Today, when I sit in the same cafe where everything started, I often notice new people practicing English on their laptops or reading books quietly. Sometimes I wonder if they are feeling the same doubts I once felt, the same uncertainty, the same quiet question in their minds. Can I really do this? If I could sit next to them and share one message, it would be this. Progress does not require perfection. It only requires persistence. A tiny change repeated every day can reshape an entire future. 10 minutes of speaking. One honest story. One small step forward. Over time, those small steps build something extraordinary. A new skill. A new confidence. Sometimes even a new life. And the beautiful thing about tiny changes is that anyone can start them today. No special tools. No perfect conditions. Just a quiet moment and the courage to begin. Because the truth is simple. A tiny change really can create a big result. And sometimes that result becomes a life you never imagined when the journey first began. Sometimes people think a big life change must start with a big decision. But this story showed something different. A quiet habit, a small cup of coffee, a simple conversation in slow English. And slowly, those tiny moments built confidence, love, family, and a new life in the United States. So, here's a question to think about tonight. What tiny change could transform your life if you started today? Maybe it's 10 minutes of speaking English. Maybe it's telling your own story out loud. Maybe it's simply choosing not to quit today. Because the truth is simple, the people who succeed are not always the most talented. They are the ones who continue one small step longer than everyone else. If this real English story practice helped you relax, think deeper, and practice listening to slow, natural English, then this channel was created for you. On this channel, you will find many more slow English stories, real-life experiences in the United States, love stories, cultural lessons, and powerful life journeys designed to help you listen, think, and speak English naturally. So before you leave, take one small action. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who is learning English or feeling close to giving up. Because the next story you hear here might be the one that changes your life too.